Hey everybody, Stephen from Allan Admissions here with an interesting question for you today. Should you hire a college counselor to help you get into your top choice school? Well, I'm a college counselor, so you might think my answer would just be, of course, hire me, please. But the answer is a little bit more nuanced than that. Let's get into it. So, the idea, of course, is that by hiring a counselor, you're going to maximize your chances of getting into your top choice school. Maybe right now you look at the admit rate for a school like Duke, see it's less than 10%, and figure, well, maybe if I hire a counselor, my odds will go up to 20, 25%, and that will be enough to get me in. But there are some limitations we need to account for that aren't necessarily obvious in the marketing materials, the videos, or anything else a counselor, myself included, might be putting out there. The first thing is the world's greatest counselor is not going to make up for a lackluster resume. If you have bad grades, if your test scores are too low, if your extracurricular activities are lacking, there's nothing we can do when you come to us your senior year to get you into your top choice school. It's like imagine if I'm 5'10", 200 pounds if I've bulked a lot. Imagine if I went to an NFL coach and said, I want to play defensive line. That coach is going to look at me and go, have you done a lot of weightlifting? Are you even at least 6'5"? Are you anything that's capable of NFL talent? And then I go, well, in eighth grade, I dreamed once of playing for the Panthers. And then the coach looks at me and goes, well, with how bad the Panthers are, maybe you can make the team. But the point being is that we can only make do with what you bring to the table. And as a student, if the grades aren't there, if the test scores aren't there, we're going to have a really hard time getting you into any of the schools that you might be looking at. The other thing to consider is that we're going to be working with multiple students a year. I don't find this to be a major issue. A smart counselor is not going to put you in a spot where he or she has so many clients that he or she can't give you enough time to work with. But this is something you'll want to keep in mind. You are not going to be the sole person working with this counselor unless said counselor is a family friend, they're retired, or some sort of other special circumstance. I'd say probably 99 out of 100 times, if you find a counselor online or you refer to them by someone and you choose to hire them, they're probably working with at least an additional 10 to 15 students per year. And even if you come to us with a really strong profile, you accept our limitations, you have to understand what we're actually doing. We're not taking you from a 5% chance at an Ivy League school to a coin flip. Like we're good at what we do. We can help you craft really strong essays. We can present your activities in the best light possible. But we are not necessarily going to 10x your odds of getting into a school. If someone is claiming as such, they're either lying, they're fudging the numbers, or the one exception I can think of that would be legitimate is if you came to them before you started high school, and then they provide a suite of services with tutoring, extracurricular advising, test prep, then they can reverse engineer your application starting in ninth grade such that by the time you get to the 12th grade, you're well prepared. But if you're coming to us for the first time in 12th grade, best case scenario, we might be doubling or tripling your odds, which sounds really good until you remember that we're going from about 5% to 10, maybe 15%. So at that point, then, it basically becomes a math question. Are you willing to spend anywhere from a few hundred to a few $1,000s, possibly even more depending on your location and who you hire, to increase your odds of getting into a certain school? It's an entirely personal question, but I do think there are some boundaries that we can set, some guidelines we can create to better establish if it's worth considering hiring a consultant in the first place. So let's look at some of these. I can think of 3 strong reasons why you should not hire a counselor. And the first is cost. Look, there are counselors out there who charge an arm and leg, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm cheap, but you will be spending a few $1,000s for a good seasoned college counselor, regardless of where you live. And it's going to be even more in a place like New York or San Francisco. There's a lot of really good information out there. Part of the purpose of this channel is to provide as much information as I can. And if you're willing to put in the time and effort to dig through the good information, to figure out what information might be hyperbole, what information might be valuable, then it doesn't really become worth the cost. Now, obviously, you're spending time instead of money, but if you get started soon enough in the summer, you can save several $1,000s just by doing the research yourself. The second factor I would say is the competitiveness of the school, or better said, the lack thereof of the competitiveness. Generally speaking, once you get above schools with a higher than 30%, maybe 40% admission rate, those colleges just aren't putting as much weight into the essays or the extracurriculars. They're more dependent upon quantifiable metrics like your GPA and your test score. And they may even have an automatic cutoff for when you can get in, such as UT, the University of Texas school system, where if you're in the top 10% of your class, for every school except UT Austin, where I believe it's top 6%, you're automatically admitted. At that spot, there's not really a benefit to hiring a counselor. Maybe if you wanted to push for some scholarships, there might be some value. But if your pure goal is to get into a certain school, that school has a 45% admit rate, and they only have one essay about why you want to attend that school, you can probably do plenty of research on your own in a relatively short enough period of time and do well enough to get into that school. And the third one, we kind of touched on this already, but the competitiveness, or again, the lack thereof of the student. I hate to say it, but if you're primarily a B student and your goal is to get into Harvard, it's just going to be a really tough time without some extremely extenuating circumstances to justify getting in. Certainly, there's always exceptions to the rule. I've been surprised, but remember, they are exceptions, and 99 out of 100 times, even when you think you are the exception, you are not. And on the flip side, I would also say there are some students, primarily legacy students, and I know legacy is going away at a lot of schools, but there are some schools that still prioritize legacies, and especially recruited athletes who just don't need a college counselor. Athletes might need their own consultants for what they're trying to do, but you're not going to need a college counselor to get into these schools given your background. So all of this is to say that probably less than 5% of you viewing this video will actually need a college consultant. It sounds surprising, but for 95% of you, spending 2 to 3 hours per week over the summer watching videos, reading materials, thinking about how you want to present yourself to these schools will make you as competitive as possible. Maybe there's room at the margin to hire someone on an hourly basis for 1 to 2 hours just to get an overall big picture look. But you definitely are not going to need to drop thousands of dollars on school packages. But that said, and now admittedly, as a college counselor, I do have a bias for believing that there is a time and place for people like myself. But I do believe that there is a genuine time and place to hire a college counselor. So what is that time and place? Well, first, are you applying to a school that has a less than 30% admit rate? Conversely, from what we were talking about in the prior point, this is a spot where the essays are going to matter more, the extracurriculars are going to matter more, nuances in how you present your information and your overall picture, your overall profile can make a huge difference, and it's very important that you get this right. This is also true for niche programs. For example, a lot of computer science programs at public universities that otherwise have a fairly high admit rate might themselves have a much more difficult admissions process. And in that case, there probably is value in hiring an admissions counselor. The second criteria we have to admit, and this takes some self-honesty and some self-reflection, is to say that you are in fact a candidate for these schools, but it's tough to say if you would get in for sure. Some general criteria, I would say, these are not hard and fast rules, but they're a good starting point. Are you in the top 10% of your class? Is your SAT above roughly 1400 or ACT above 32? Do you have an extensive extracurricular profile? What does that mean? That means that you've got experiences that you have continued to do since freshman year. You have at least 1 or 2 leadership positions. with your essays? Do you feel like you're a good writer, maybe not a great one? Do you feel like you have some good ideas, but you're not 100% sure of what direction they can ultimately go in or how best they reflect you? That's a spot where, yes, hiring a counselor can make sense. And it's not like if you're in the top 11%, that's an automatic cutoff. The conversation just becomes a little bit more difficult, and you need to be a little bit more honest about how competitive you might be for these schools. And finally, it seems obvious, but it needs to be said, can you afford it? A counselor is not worth going into debt for, whether it's out of your pocket or your parents' pocket. We can definitely tilt the scales a bit, but we have to be realistic here and say that spending $50,000 if your household income is $70,000 a year, that's not worth the investment. Like, we cannot be the ones who just magically increase the odds from 5% to 50% for Harvard, Stanford, et al. You have to be smart about this, even if it's your parents' money. Remember that your parents are the ones who will probably be contributing mostly to college, and you don't want to be put in a spot where what you're spending on a college counselor takes away from what you would ultimately pay for college itself. So let's try and summarize this with some take-home points, looking at one, competitiveness of school, and one, competitiveness of you as a student. Again, these are just ballpark numbers. These are not hard and fast rules. But be honest with yourself. Be aware that if you're outside these numbers, you need a fairly compelling reason for why you might go against the grain on these. I referenced earlier admit rate. This slide here is talking about US News rankings. They roughly correlate to each other. You can use either one as a proxy, but for the purposes of this slide, we're just going to go by rankings. If your school that you're applying to, especially if it's your top choice school, is outside the top 50 on US News and World Report, you probably don't need a counselor. The competitiveness of the school, the requirements for the school just aren't going to be extensive and tough enough to justify hiring a counselor. If your school is ranked between 15th and 50th, it kind of becomes a gray area. How is your candidacy as a student? What's the extent of the essays that the school is requiring? These are questions that you'll want to ask to decide if it's worth it. Finally, if your school is ranked in the top 15, you either need to spend money on a good college counselor, or you need to spend time researching how to craft your essays, your activities, to best match the school that you're going for. And for you as a student, again, just ballpark figures, ballpark estimates. If you're outside the top 20% of your class, you probably don't need a counselor. There's only so much we can do outside extremely unusual circumstances to justify being hired. If you're ranked between 11 and 20%, again, it kind of becomes a gray area. I could see a scenario where maybe you're the top 12%, but after freshman year, you're top 5%. Maybe you had a really bad freshman year. Maybe you had extenuating circumstances where you had to miss a lot of time one semester. Those can be gray areas where it might be worth it, but I wouldn't call it an automatic yes. And finally, top 10% students, same idea as top 15 colleges. I would say you either want to spend the money on a good college counselor, or you want to spend the time on the schools you're going for to make sure that you maximize your chances of presenting the best profile possible. And that's it for the video, everybody. I'm going to go try and find some ways to bulk up to play for the Panthers. If you have any questions, leave a comment, message me on my website, check out the links below. And until the next video, we'll see you then. Bye.